Most people think they know what Sparta was. They watched 300. They saw the red capes and the slow-motion spear throws, and they thought, yeah, that looks tough, but I could handle it. No, you could not. The movie showed you about 5% of what Sparta actually was, and it made that 5% look cool. The reality was not cool. The reality was one of the most brutal and unforgiving civilizations that has ever existed on this planet. Everything about how Sparta operated was designed to make you suffer, not as a punishment, as a system. Suffering was the entire point. It was built into every single part of daily life from the moment you were born until the moment you died. And there was no opting out. There was no saying, I do not feel like doing this today. There was no quitting. You either kept going or you were destroyed. That was it. Those were your two options. Let me start with something that most people do not even think about. The moment you were born in Sparta, you were already being judged. You did not get to just exist. You did not get to just be a baby and cry and be held by your parents and slowly grow up. No, the second you came out, the elders of the city inspected you. They looked at your body, they checked your limbs, they checked if you looked strong enough. And if you did not pass that inspection, if you looked too small or too weak, or if something about your body was not right in their eyes, they took you away from your parents. They carried you to a place called the Apothete, which was basically a pit at the base of Mount Taygetus, and they left you there. They left you there to die. A baby, just left on a mountainside because the city decided you were not worth raising. That is where your life in Sparta could end before it even started. You did not get a chance. You did not get time to grow into your body or prove yourself later. If the elders looked at you and decided no, that was it, you were done. And your parents had no say in it. Your mother, who just went, they also deliberately did not give you enough food. This was not because Sparta was poor. Sparta had plenty of food. They starved you on purpose. The idea was that hunger would teach you to be resourceful. If you were hungry, you were expected to go steal food. But here is the catch. If you got caught stealing, they did not punish you for stealing. They punished you for getting caught. The crime in Sparta was not theft. The crime was being bad at it. So you had to learn to be sneaky and cunning and clever, because if you were clumsy about it, you got beaten. And not a light smack, a real beating. The kind that left marks. The kind that made it hard to walk the next day. There is a famous story about a Spartan boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. When an elder came by and started talking to him, the boy stood there at attention and said nothing, even as the fox was clawing and biting into his stomach under the cloak. The boy stood there and did not flinch and did not make a sound until the fox literally tore open his abdomen and the boy fell down dead. He chose death over the shame of being caught stealing. That story was told in Sparta as an example of what a good Spartan boy should be. Not as a horror story, as an inspiration. That should tell you everything about the kind of world this was. So picture yourself at 8 or 9 years old. You are constantly hungry. You are freezing cold. You are sleeping on a pile of reeds. And you are getting beaten regularly, either in training or as punishment for failing at something. That is your daily life. That is just a normal Tuesday in Sparta. And the physical training was relentless. From the time you entered the Agoge, you were training to fight every single day. You ran, you wrestled, you learned to use weapons, you fought other boys. And these were not friendly sparring matches with rules and referees. These were real fights where real injuries happened. Broken bones, lost teeth, black eyes, bleeding wounds. dislocated shoulders, cracked ribs. The trainers did not stop fights when someone got hurt. Getting hurt was the point. You were supposed to learn how to take a hit and keep going. You were supposed to learn that pain is just a feeling and feelings do not matter. What matters is that you keep fighting. If you cried, you were shamed. If you showed weakness, you were punished even more. The other boys would mock you. The trainers would single you out. The entire system was built to strip away everything soft about you until all that was left was a hard, ruthless fighting machine. There was a specific ritual that really shows how insane this was. It was called the Diamastagosis, and it happened at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. Basically, what happened is that boys were flogged, whipped, in front of an audience. And the goal was not to scream. The goal was not to cry out. You stood there and you took it, and if you could endure the most lashes without making a sound, you won. People actually died during this ritual. They were literally beaten to death and still tried not to scream because the shame of screaming was considered worse than death itself. Let that sink in. The shame of showing pain was worse than actually dying from pain. That was the mentality Sparta installed in its people. That is what they considered normal. This was not some extreme fringe thing. This was a public ceremony that people came to watch like it was a sporting event. Spectators sat in stands and watched children get whipped, and they cheered for the ones who stayed quiet the longest. And you think you would survive there because you go to the gym 3 times a week? No, you would not. Let us talk about what happened when you got older, because it did not get easier. When you reached about age 18, you entered a more advanced stage of training. You were now being prepared for actual war. The exercises got harder, the fights got more dangerous, and they added new elements to test you. One of the big ones was the Krypteia. The Krypteia was basically a secret police force made up of the best young Spartan men. If you were selected for the Krypteia, you were sent out into the countryside with nothing but a knife. No food, no supplies, no backup, no shelter. And your job was to survive on your own in the wilderness and also to terrorize and kill Helots. The Helots were basically enslaved people who worked the land for Sparta. They were the descendants of people Sparta had conquered generations earlier. Every year, the Spartan government formally declared war on the Helots so that killing them would not technically be murder. Let me say that again, because it is important. Every single year, the government officially declared war on an enslaved population that lived within its own borders, just so that its soldiers could kill them without legal consequences. So as a young Spartan man, your job during the Krypteia was to sneak around at night and kill enslaved people who were just trying to survive. That was considered a training exercise. That was considered a normal part of growing up. Think about what that does to a person psychologically. You are 18 or 19 years old and you are being told to go out alone into the wilderness and kill people. Not enemy soldiers, not warriors. Farmers and workers who had no weapons and no way to fight back. People who were sleeping in their homes after a long day of forced labor. And you had to do it because that was what the state required. If you refused, you were a coward. If you failed, you were weak. There was no room for mercy or empathy or basic human decency. Those emotions were trained out of you years ago, back when you were 8 years old, getting beaten for crying. By the time you reached the Krypteia, you were already so hardened that killing was just another task on the list. And if that idea makes you uncomfortable, then congratulations, you just proved my point. You would not survive in Sparta because you still have a conscience. Sparta did everything in its power to destroy that in you. Now, let us say you made it through all of that. You survived the infant inspection. You survived being taken from your family at 7. You survived years of starvation and beatings and freezing cold and brutal training. You survived the Krypteia. You are now a full Spartan soldier at age 20. Guess what? You still do not get to live a normal life. You do not get to go home and relax. You do not get your own house and your own space and your own freedom. At age 20, you became a full citizen and a member of the Spartan army, but you were required to live in the barracks with other soldiers until you were 30 years old. 30. That means even if you got married, and Spartans did get married, you could not live with your wife. You had to sneak out of the barracks at night to see her, and then sneak back before anyone noticed you were gone. If you got caught, you were shamed and mocked. Your own marriage had to be conducted in secret like some kind of crime. You could not eat meals with your wife and family. You had to eat at the common mess hall called the Suffocating with your eunuch. Every single day, the same food, the same people, the same table, for years and years and years. And participation was not optional. Missing a meal at the Suffocating without a good reason, like being on a hunt, was seen as a serious offense. The mess hall was where bonds between soldiers were formed and maintained, and skipping out meant you were not committed to your brothers in arms. The food at the mess hall was famously terrible, by the way. The main dish was something called black broth or melissomas. It was made from pork, cooked in blood and vinegar. Visitors from other Greek cities who tried it said it was the most disgusting thing they had ever tasted. There is a famous story about a man from the city of Sybaris, which was known for its luxury, who tasted black broth and said, "Now I understand why Spartans are so willing to die in battle. Because life was so miserable that death was preferable." That was a joke, but it also was not really a joke. Life in Sparta was genuinely so harsh and so stripped of pleasure that fighting and dying in battle was honestly one of the more exciting things you could do. There was no good food to look forward to, no nice home to relax in, no entertainment to enjoy. Battle was the closest thing to a thrill that Sparta offered. And speaking of dying in battle, that is exactly what Sparta expected you to do. The whole point of your existence as a Spartan man was to fight and, if necessary, die for the state. There was no retirement plan. There was no concept of, "I have served my time and now I get to rest." You were a soldier from age 7 until you were too old to hold a spear. And the way you were expected to fight was absolutely terrifying. The Spartan phalanx was a wall of shields and spears that moved together as one unit. You stood shoulder to shoulder with the men next to you, and you pushed forward into the enemy. The shield you carried was enormous and heavy. It was called an aspis, and it weighed around 15 to 20 pounds. You held it on your left arm, and it protected not just you, but the man to your left. That is why throwing away your shield was the ultimate disgrace. When you dropped your shield, you were not just abandoning your own defense. You were exposing the man next to you. You were betraying your brother. If the man next to you died, you closed the gap and kept pushing. If you were wounded, you kept fighting. Running away was not just frowned upon. It was the single worst thing a Spartan could do. The most famous thing a Spartan mother could say to her son was, "Come back with your shield or on it." That meant either you win and come home carrying your shield, or you die and they carry your body home on your shield. There was no third option. There was no come home having run away. That was not acceptable. If you threw down your shield and ran, you were marked for life. You were called a tresantus, which means trembler. Your family was shamed. Nobody would eat with you or talk to you or do business with you. You became a non-person walking around in a city that pretended you did not exist. You had to wear a special cloak with colored patches so everyone could see what you were. And in some cases, you were actually expected to kill yourself rather than live with that shame. Death was better than cowardice in the Spartan mind. Always. No exceptions. Let me also talk about what life was like for women in Sparta, because it is important to understand that the brutal culture affected everyone, not just the men. Spartan women actually had more freedom than women in most other Greek cities, which sounds like a good thing until you understand why. Spartan women were given freedom and education and physical training because the state wanted them to produce strong babies. That was the reason. You were not free because Sparta believed in equality or women's rights. You were free because a strong, healthy, active mother was more likely to give birth to a strong, healthy baby who could grow up to be a strong soldier. Everything in Sparta always came back to the military. Even the freedoms that seemed progressive were actually just another part of the war machine. Spartan women exercised and competed in athletics. They ate well. They were educated. They could own property. All of these things were unusual for women in the ancient Greek world. But the motivation behind all of it was military. Strong mothers made strong soldiers. That was the calculation, and that was the only calculation that mattered. Spartan women were expected to be tough and stoic, just like the men. When their sons died in battle, they were not supposed to cry or grieve openly. They were supposed to be proud. There are stories of Spartan mothers who killed their own sons for showing cowardice in battle. There is one story about a mother who heard her son had survived a battle by running away. When he came home, she reportedly said, "The earth should swallow you up." Whether these stories are true or exaggerated, the fact that they existed and were celebrated tells you everything about the culture. Weakness in any form was the ultimate sin. Even a mother's natural love could not override the demands of the state. Now let me get into some of the day-to-day realities that people never think about when they fantasize about ancient warriors. Forget the battles and the training for a moment. Think about basic comfort. Think about the things you do every single day without even thinking about them. You wake up in a warm bed with a mattress and sheets and blankets and probably a pillow that is the exact firmness you like. You take a hot shower with soap and shampoo. You brush your teeth with toothpaste. You eat whatever you want for breakfast. You put on clean clothes that you chose because you liked them. You check your phone. You go about your day with hundreds of small comforts that you do not even notice anymore because they are just part of the background of your life. None of that existed in Sparta. None of it. You woke up on reds or a hard wooden surface. There was no hot water anywhere. There was no shower at all most of the time. You washed in cold streams or rivers, if you washed at all. Soap as we know it did not exist. The ancient Greeks used olive oil and a scraping tool called a strigil to clean themselves. You rubbed oil on your body and then scraped the oil and dirt off with a curved metal blade. Your food was chosen for you and it was bland and minimal and deliberately insufficient. Your clothes were the one cloak you were given for the year. You owned almost nothing personal because personal possessions were discouraged. The state provided what it thought you needed and that was it. Nothing more, nothing less. No choices, no preferences, no comfort. There was no entertainment the way we think of it. No books to read for fun because most Spartans could barely read anyway. Since the Agoge focused on military training, not academics. No games to play just for pleasure. No sitting around and relaxing on a day off because there were no days off. The closest thing Sparta had to entertainment was war games and athletic competitions, which were really just more training dressed up as fun. Even music and poetry in Sparta were focused on military themes. The songs were about battle and glory and dying well. The poetry celebrated warriors, not lovers or dreamers or thinkers. Everything circled back to the same thing. You exist to fight. You exist to serve the state. Your personal happiness and comfort and desires mean absolutely nothing. Think about temperature for a second. We live in a world where if it is too hot, we turn on the air conditioning, and if it is too cold, we turn on the heat. We have jackets and sweaters and blankets and heated seats in our cars and heated floors in our homes. Sparta is in southern Greece in a region called Laconia. Summers were extremely hot and dry. You were training in that heat, running an armor in that heat, fighting in that heat. Temperatures could easily reach the high 90s or above, and winters in the mountains around Sparta got genuinely cold. Not like Northern Europe cold, but cold enough that being outside with one thin cloak and no shoes was absolutely miserable. Yes, no shoes. Spartan boys in the Agoge were often barefoot. The idea was that shoes made your feet soft, and soft feet could not march long distances over rough terrain. So you walked and ran and trained barefoot on rocks and dirt and thorns and gravel until the soles of your feet were like leather. Your feet would bleed and crack and blister and develop calluses so thick you could step on sharp stones without flinching. Does that sound like something you could handle? Be honest with yourself right now. Hygiene was also nothing like what you were used to. There was no soap the way we know it. No toothbrush, no toothpaste, no deodorant, no toilet paper. When you used the bathroom, you used a communal sponge on a stick called a tessorium. I am not making that up. That was a real thing in the ancient world. Everyone shared it. You rinsed it off in a bucket of water or vinegar, and the next person used it. Think about that for a second. Really think about it. Now think about how many people used it before you and how well they rinsed it. Infections and diseases spread constantly because nobody understood germs or bacteria or how illness actually worked. A small cut could kill you because there were no antibiotics. A bad tooth could kill you because there was no dentist who could properly fix it. An infected blister on your bare feet could turn into something that killed you within days. People died from things that we fix today with a 10-minute visit to a clinic and a prescription for some pills. A stomach bug that would make you uncomfortable for a day or two in the modern world could end your life in ancient Sparta, because your body was already weakened from malnutrition and exhaustion and constant physical stress. Your immune system was running on empty all the time. Speaking of medical care, there was essentially none in the way you think of it. If you got wounded in battle or in training, your options were extremely limited. They might pour wine or vinegar on the wound because they noticed that helped sometimes, even though they did not know why. They might pack it with herbs or honey. They might cauterize it, which means they would press a red-hot piece of metal against your open wound to burn it closed. No anesthesia, no painkillers. You just bit down on a piece of leather and tried not to scream while someone literally burned your flesh to seal a gash. If a bone was broken badly enough, it might be set roughly back into place and wrapped up with strips of cloth, but if it healed wrong, which it often did, you just lived with a crooked limb for the rest of your life. If a wound got infected, and it often did, there was nothing anyone could do. You either fought off the infection yourself, or you died. If an injury was severe enough, you could easily just bleed out and die right there on the ground, because there was no concept of a blood transfusion or emergency surgery or any of the life-saving techniques that we take for granted. Battlefield medicine in the ancient world was basically just hoping your body could fix itself, and if it could not, then you died. That is it. That is the entire medical system. Mental health is something else that people never think about when they fantasize about living in ancient civilizations. We have therapists and counselors and psychiatrists and medications and support groups and hotlines and apps and books and podcasts about mental health today. We have an entire industry built around helping people process trauma and manage their emotions. And even with all of that, millions of people still struggle every single day. Now imagine living in a society where mental health is not even a concept that exists. where the word for it does not exist, where showing emotion of any kind is considered weakness, where you are exposed to violence and death from the time you are a small child, where you witness people being killed as a routine part of your training, where you yourself are expected to kill starting in your late teens. The psychological damage would be enormous. In the modern world, we call that post-traumatic stress disorder. In Sparta, they just called it life. There was no treatment. There was no acknowledgement that what you were going through was harmful to your mind. If you broke down mentally, you were simply considered weak and you were discarded. You were not given help. You were given shame and isolation. That is absolutely devastating. Let me also talk about something that people never consider, which is sleep. You need sleep to function. Every human being on the planet needs rest. Modern science tells us that the average person needs somewhere between 7 and 9 hours of quality sleep per night to be healthy and to think clearly and to perform well physically. In Sparta, you were not getting that. The barracks were loud. You were sharing a room with dozens of other boys or men. People snored. People got up in the night. The beds were hard and uncomfortable. You were often cold. You were often hungry. And training started early in the morning, no matter how poorly you slept. There was no sleeping in. There was no hitting the snooze button. When it was time to get up, you got up, and if you were tired, that was your problem. Chronic sleep deprivation, which is what every person in the Agoge was experiencing, affects everything. Your mood, your ability to heal from injuries, your immune system, your decision-making, your emotional regulation. Everything gets worse when you do not sleep enough. And in Sparta, you were never sleeping enough. You were running on empty all the time, and you were still expected to perform at your absolute peak every single day. And then there is the issue of water. Clean drinking water is something we barely think about. You turn on a tap and clean water comes out. In ancient Sparta, the water came from rivers and streams and wells. It was not filtered. It was not treated. It was not tested for contaminants. Whatever was in that water, you drank it. Animal waste, runoff from the fields, bacteria, parasites, all of it went straight into your body. Waterborne diseases were extremely common in the ancient world, and they killed a lot of people. Dysentery alone, which is basically severe diarrhea caused by contaminated water, was a major killer. You could go from healthy to dead in a matter of days just from drinking bad water. And there was nothing you could do to prevent it because nobody understood what caused it. They did not know about microscopic organisms. They did not know about contamination. If you got sick from the water, you just got sick, and either your body fought it off or it did not. Insects were another constant problem that modern people never think about. There was no bug spray, no screens on the windows, because there were no windows as we know them. No mosquito-nets, flies were everywhere, especially in the heat of summer. They landed on your food. They landed on your wounds. They spread disease constantly. Mosquitoes carried malaria, which was endemic in parts of ancient Greece. Lice were incredibly common and almost impossible to get rid of. Fleas infested the bedding. Ticks latched onto you when you trained in the fields and forests. These were not minor annoyances. These were disease vectors that could and did kill people regularly. A single mosquito bite could give you malaria, which could kill you or leave you with recurring fevers for the rest of your life. And there was absolutely nothing you could do about any of it except endure it. Pain was also just a constant companion in a way that modern people cannot relate to. Think about the last time you had a headache. You probably took some ibuprofen or acetaminophen, and within an hour the pain was gone. In Sparta, if you had a headache, you just had a headache. There was nothing to take for it. If you had a toothache, and this was extremely common because dental hygiene was non-existent, you just lived with that throbbing, agonizing pain until the tooth either fell out or you found someone brave enough to try to pull it out for you with no anesthesia. If you pulled a muscle during training, you kept training on that pulled muscle. If you sprained an ankle, you kept running on that sprained ankle. Pain management as a concept did not exist. You were just in pain. All the time. Varying degrees of pain from minor aches to screaming agony, and you were expected to function through all of it without complaint. The Spartans believed that enduring pain without showing it was one of the highest virtues a person could have. So not only were you in pain constantly, but you could not even express that you were in pain without being shamed for it. You had to suffer in silence. Every single day. Now let us talk about the social hierarchy, because even among Spartans, there were levels and you probably would not be at the top. Full Spartan citizens were called the Spartiates, or the homoi, which meant equals. But to be one of them, you had to meet certain requirements. You had to complete the entire Agoge, which lasted from age 7 to age 20. You had to be accepted into a Syssitia mess group, which required the unanimous vote of every single person already in that group. One single no vote from anyone and you were rejected. Think about that. You could survive 13 years of the most brutal training imaginable and still be shut out of full citizenship because one guy at the dinner table did not like you. And you also had to contribute a certain amount of food and resources to the common mess from your estate every month. If you could not meet your contribution because your land was not producing enough, or, for any other reason, you lost your status as a full citizen, you became what was called an inferior or a hypermaion. And inferiors were treated terribly. You went from being a respected member of society to being practically invisible, all because you could not keep up your payments. So, even after surviving everything the Agoge threw at you, your status was never secure. One bad harvest and you could lose everything you spent your entire painful childhood earning. Below the Spartiates were the Perioko, who were free people but not full citizens. They lived in communities around Sparta and handled the trade and crafts and manufacturing that fall. Spartans considered beneath them because Spartans only did one thing, and that was war. The Perioiko had to serve in the army when called upon, but they had no political rights and no real say in how things were run, and below them were the Helots. The Helots were the enslaved population, and they vastly outnumbered the Spartans. Some historians estimate there were 7 or even 10 Helots for every one Spartan citizen. The Helots did all the farming and all the manual labor that kept the entire Spartan economy running. Without the Helots, Sparta could not have existed. The soldiers would have had to farm their own food and they would have had no time to train. But the Helots were treated horrifically. They were humiliated on purpose. They were sometimes forced to get drunk in public so that Spartan boys could see what drunkenness looked like and be disgusted by it. They were beaten regularly and sometimes for no reason at all. They could be killed at any time thanks to the annual declaration of war against them. They lived in constant fear every single day and night of their lives. And here is the thing. If you were magically transported back to ancient Sparta, you probably would not end up as a Spartiate. The Spartiates were a tiny, elite minority. The odds are much, much higher that you would end up as a Helot. And life as a Helot was infinitely worse than anything I've described so far. As a Helot, you worked the land all day, every day, in scorching heat or freezing cold. The food you grew went to your Spartan masters first, and you kept whatever scraps were left over, which was barely enough to keep you alive. You had no rights, no legal protections, no recourse. If a Spartan beat you, nothing happened to them. If a Spartan killed you, nothing happened to them. You were property. Less than property, actually, because the Spartans at least took care of their weapons and armor and polished their shields. You were expendable. replaceable, if you tried to revolt. And the Helots did try several times. You were crushed with overwhelming force and made into an example for everyone else. After one major revolt, Sparta supposedly identified the 2,000 bravest and most capable Helots, offered them freedom as a reward for their courage. Those 2,000 Helots were never seen again. They just disappeared, killed quietly to remove any potential leaders from the enslaved population. That is the kind of ruthless calculation Sparta was capable of. Let me talk about Spartan law and government, because people often assume that ancient civilizations had some form of fairness built in. Sparta was run by 2 kings who shared power along with a council of elders called the Gerousia and a group of 5 elected officials called the Ephors. The 2 kings came from 2 royal families, and the system might sound balanced, but in practice it was extremely rigid and controlling. Laws in Sparta were famously not written down for most of its history. The legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, who may or may not have been a real person, supposedly made the Spartans swear an oath not to write down their laws. They were oral traditions passed down and enforced by custom and by the authority of the elders. That meant that people in power could interpret the laws however they wanted. If you were accused of something, your trial was not like anything you would recognize today. There was no defense attorney. There was no presumption of innocence. There was no jury of your peers. The elders or the Ephors decided your fate based on their judgment, and that was final. If they decided you were guilty, you were guilty. If they decided your punishment was exile or death, then that is what happened. No appeals. No second chances. Sparta also had extremely strict rules about wealth and displays of luxury. You were not allowed to show off. You were not allowed to live lavishly. The whole society was built around the idea that everyone should be equal, at least among the Spartiates, and that meant nobody could have nicer things than anyone else. Gold and silver coins were actually banned for a long time. Instead, Sparta used iron bars as currency, which were deliberately heavy and impracticable so that nobody would want to accumulate wealth. Some sources say these iron bars were also quenched in vinegar to make them brittle and useless for anything except as money. Think about that. The money was literally designed to be annoying and worthless to have in large quantities. If you had a lot of it, you could not even store it easily, because iron bars take up space and weigh a ton. This was intentional. Sparta wanted to eliminate the desire for wealth, because wealth led to inequality, and inequality led to division, and division weakened the military. Everything always came back to the military. Every law, every custom, every aspect of daily life was filtered through one question, and that question was, does this make us better at war? If the answer was no, then it was not allowed. You could not travel freely either. Spartans were discouraged from traveling to other cities because outside contact might introduce soft or foreign ideas. If you went to Athens and saw how people there lived with their theaters and their philosophy schools and their beautiful architecture and their comfortable homes and their freedom of speech and thought, you might start to question why Sparta was so harsh. And questioning was dangerous. Questioning the system was questioning the state, and questioning the state was treason. Foreigners were also periodically expelled from Sparta in events called Xenolasia. The city did not want outside influence of any kind. It wanted to remain pure and hard and focused entirely on war. So if you were used to the idea of going wherever you want and doing whatever you want and thinking whatever you want and saying whatever you want and saying whatever you, freedom of thought was not a value there. Freedom of thought was not a value there. Freedom of expression was not a value. Conformity was the value. Individual expression was seen as a direct threat to the stability of the state. Let me talk about relationships and family life a bit more, because this is another area where the modern mind cannot really comprehend the Spartan reality. Marriage in Sparta was not romantic. It was practical. It was transactional. You got married because the state needed you to produce children who would become the next generation of soldiers. The wedding ritual itself was bizarre and uncomfortable by our standards. The bride had her head shaved completely bald and was dressed in men's clothing and sandals. She was left alone in a dark room on a bed. The groom would then come in briefly in the dark and then leave and go back to his barracks. That was the wedding night. There was no reception, no celebration, no dancing, no cake, no honeymoon, no waking up next to your partner the next morning. You barely spent any time with your spouse at all, because the men lived in the barracks until age 30. So, for potentially the first 10 or more years of your marriage, you were sneaking around like a criminal just to see the person you were supposedly building a life with. Romance as a concept barely existed in Sparta. Affection was not the point. Connection was not the point. Producing healthy warrior children was the point, and once that was achieved, the relationship had served its purpose. Children belonged to the state, not to you. We already talked about how boys were taken at age 7. But even before that, you as a parent had limited say in how your child was raised. The state could inspect your child at any time. The state decided if your child was fit to live on the day it was born. You did not have parental rights the way we understand them. Your child was Sparta's child first and your child second. You were just the vessel that produced them. And if your child turned out to be a coward or a weakling that reflected on you and your entire family line, the pressure to produce strong, capable children was enormous, because the consequences of failure were total social destruction. Your name would be disgraced. Your family would be shamed. Everything you endured in your own childhood would feel like it was for nothing. Imagine also the psychological weight of living in a society that was permanently at war or preparing for war. There was never a time when Sparta was truly at peace and relaxed. Even during periods when no active battle was happening, the entire city was on a war footing. Training continued every day. Discipline was enforced every day. The culture of hardness and denial was maintained every day. You never got to let your guard down. You never got to just be a normal person living a normal, quiet life. Every single day was structured around the idea that an enemy could appear at any moment, and you needed to be ready to fight and die at a moment's notice. That kind of permanent tension and hypervigilance does terrible things to a person over time. It grinds you down mentally and emotionally. It makes you paranoid and rigid and unable to experience joy or peace, because those feelings require relaxation, and relaxation was weakness, and weakness could get you killed. You were never allowed to just breathe. The landscape itself was not kind either. Laconia, where Sparta was located, is a region surrounded by mountain ranges, including the Tagetes Range to the west and the Parnan Range to the east. The terrain is rocky and harsh. The valley where Sparta sat was fertile enough, near the Eurotas River, but the surrounding land was difficult. The soil was not the best in Greece, which is part of why Sparta relied so heavily on Helot labor to squeeze every possible crop out of the ground. It was not a tropical paradise. It was not a gentle, welcoming land. It was a hard landscape that produced hard people, and the Spartans took pride in that fact. Consider also the constant lurking threat of Helot revolt. The Helots outnumbered the Spartan citizens by a massive margin, and the Spartans were fully aware of it. This created a society that was always looking over its shoulder, always on edge. Always afraid not just of external enemies like the Persians or the Athenians, but of the very people who grew their food and maintained their entire way of life. There is a deep irony in the fact that Sparta, which prided itself on fearlessness and courage above all else, was fundamentally a society built on fear. Fear of the Helots rising up, fear of weakness within its own ranks, fear of change and outside influence, fear of anything that might weaken the iron grip the state had on every aspect of life. The entire system was driven by fear, even though it spent all its time pretending to be driven by courage and strength. And let us not forget that Sparta eventually declined and fell. All of that suffering, all of that brutality, all of those centuries of turning children into weapons and enslaving entire populations and crushing any hint of individuality or creativity or joy. It did not last. It was not sustainable. By the 4th and 3rd centuries, BC Sparta was a shadow of its former self. The population of full Spartan citizens had been collapsing for decades because their own system was too rigid to sustain itself. The strict rules about land ownership and mess contributions and citizenship requirements meant that more and more Spartans lost their full status over time, and there was no mechanism to replace them. The citizen population that had once been perhaps 8,000 or more shrank to just a few hundred by the time of King Agoge IV in the 3rd century BC. Sparta effectively ate itself alive. The machine consumed its own parts. The very rigidity that made it powerful made it completely unable to adapt to changing circumstances, and in a changing world, the inability to adapt is a death sentence. Other Greek cities evolved and grew. Athens developed democracy and philosophy and theater and trade networks that spread its cultural influence across the entire Mediterranean world and far into the future. Athens gave us Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Sophocles and Euripides and the foundations of Western thought. Sparta gave us warriors who were really good at fighting in one specific formation and not much else of lasting value. When the world changed and new military tactics emerged, and new powers like Macedon and Rome rose up, Sparta had nothing to fall back on. No great thinkers, no cultural exports, no economic innovation, no intellectual tradition, just a declining handful of extremely tough but increasingly irrelevant soldiers clinging to traditions that no longer worked in a world that had moved on without them. There is a lesson in that, and it is an important one. Being tough is not enough. Being hard is not enough. If toughness is all you have, then the moment toughness stops being the most important thing in the room, you have absolutely nothing left. Let me also mention what happened when you got old in Sparta. In our world, aging is supported. We have retirement homes and pensions and social security and family support systems. In Sparta, if you lived long enough to grow old, which many did not, you were respected as an elder, but your physical decline was brutal. There was no comfort care, no pain medication for your aching joints and broken down body. All those years of brutal training and fighting caught up with you. Old injuries flared up. Bones that healed wrong decades ago caused chronic pain. The accumulated damage to your body from a lifetime of extreme physical abuse was enormous. And unlike today, where an elderly person can get a hip replacement or take medication for arthritis or have surgery for chronic conditions, in Sparta you just deteriorated. You sat on the council if you were important enough, and you watched younger men go through the same hell you went through, and you considered that normal. The cycle just kept repeating. Death in Sparta was treated differently than in most other Greek cities too. When a Spartan man died, his grave was usually unmarked. No headstone, no monument, no memorial. The only exceptions were men who died in battle and women who died in childbirth. Those two categories of death were the only ones considered glorious enough to deserve a marked grave. Think about what that says about the values of the society. Your life was only considered worthy of remembrance if you died violently fighting enemies, or if you died producing the next generation of fighters. Any other death, no matter how long or how full your life was considered unremarkable. You could live to be 90 years old and survive everything. Sparta threw at you, and when you finally died of old age, your grave would be completely anonymous, as if you never existed at all. The only thing Sparta truly valued was sacrifice for the state. If your death did not serve the state, then your death did not matter. I want to also draw a comparison that might help this click for you. Think about the most difficult thing you have ever done in your life. Maybe it was running a marathon. Maybe it was getting through a really tough period at school or work. Maybe it was dealing with a loss or a breakup or a health scare. Think about the hardest thing you have personally been through. Now understand that for a Spartan, that thing you were thinking of would have been considered a vacation. It would have been considered a break, a relief. The most difficult thing in your life would not even register on the scale of what Spartans dealt with on a daily basis from childhood. That is not meant to diminish what you have been through. Your struggles are real and valid, but it is meant to illustrate just how far removed our modern experience is from what life in ancient Sparta actually demanded. We live in completely different universes of human experience. There is also the matter of choice, which is maybe the most important difference of all. Right now in your life, you have choices. You can choose what to eat. You can choose what to wear. You can choose where to live and who to spend time with and what career to pursue and what hobbies to enjoy and what music to listen to and what to believe in and what to value. Choice is the foundation of modern life. We do not even think about it because it is everywhere. But in Sparta, choice did not exist. Not in any meaningful way. The state chose for you. From the moment you were born to the moment you died, every major decision was made by the collective. What you ate, what you wore, where you lived, who you lived with, how you spent your time, what you trained for, when you fought, how you fought, whether you lived or died. None of that was up to you. You were a component in a machine, and components do not get to have preferences. The complete absence of personal agency that defined life in Sparta is something that would psychologically destroy most modern humans within days. We are so accustomed to choosing that having all choice removed would feel like a form of torture. And in many ways it was. So let us recap everything you would have to deal with if you were somehow dropped into ancient Sparta. First, you would have to survive being born, which was not guaranteed, since the elders could decide to leave you on a mountain to die. Then you would have to survive being ripped from your family at age 7 and thrown into the Agoge. Then you would have to survive years of deliberate starvation and exposure to extreme weather and regular beatings and brutal physical training. Then you would have to survive the Krypteia, which meant living alone in the wilderness and killing enslaved people as a test of your readiness. Then you would have to survive actual warfare, where the expectation was that you either win or you die fighting, and anything less was a disgrace worse than death. Then you would have to live in military barracks, away from your family, until you were 30 years old. Then you would have to spend the rest of your entire life on a permanent war footing, never relaxing, never pursuing your own interests, never experiencing the kind of freedom and comfort and choice that you currently take for granted every single day of your life. And all of this assumes you would end up as a spar sheet, which is the absolute best case scenario. If you ended up as a Pariorco, your life would be limited and controlled, and you would have no political voice. If you ended up as a Helot, your life would be a waking nightmare of enslavement and fear and random. Violence was zero hope of ever escaping because the most powerful and ruthless. military machine in all of Greece was designed specifically to keep you in chains forever. You are sitting right now reading this on a phone or a computer or a tablet. You are probably in a room with climate control. You are probably within arm's reach of more food than a Spartan boy saw in a week. You have access to more entertainment and knowledge and connection than any Spartan king could have dreamed of. You have medical care that would seem like genuine sorcery to an ancient person. You can say whatever you want. Think whatever you want. Go wherever you want. Wear whatever you want. Eat whatever you want. Love whoever you want. You have freedoms and comforts that would be incomprehensible to someone from ancient Sparta. And you probably still complain about your Wi-Fi being slow sometimes, or your food delivery taking too long. I am not judging you for that. I complain about that stuff too. We all do. But the point is that the gap between your current life and life in ancient Sparta is so absolutely enormous that it is almost impossible for a modern human brain to truly comprehend how different and how much worse it was. You are soft, I am soft. We are all soft compared to what Sparta demanded of its people. And that is not an insult. That is not me putting you down. It is just a fact about the world we live in. We are soft because we have been fortunate enough to live in a time and a place where softness is not a death sentence. We live in a world that has progressed to the point where you do not need to be a relentless killing machine just to make it through the day. That is a good thing. That is called progress. But it also means that if you were somehow thrown back in time to ancient Sparta, you would absolutely crumble. The cold would break you. The hunger would break you. The violence would break you. The total absence of freedom and comfort and choice and individuality would break you. The psychological horror of what that society demanded from every single one of its people would break you. You would not last a week in the Agoge. You probably would not last a single day. And the Spartans would look at you and see exactly what they feared most in the world: weakness, and they would not help you. They would not feel sorry for you. They would discard you the same way they discarded every baby on that mountainside that did not look strong enough on its very first day of life. That is the truth about ancient Sparta. Not the cool movie version with the epic soundtrack and the heroic slow-motion battle speeches. The real version. The version where babies were left to die on mountains, where children were starved and beaten and frozen and systematically turned into killers before they were old enough to understand what was being done to them. Where an entire population of human beings was enslaved and terrorized for generations so that a small group of warriors could spend their whole lives doing nothing but training for war. Where love and joy and creativity and freedom and individual thought were all considered direct threats to the state and were systematically crushed out of existence. Sparta was impressive in many ways, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Its military achievements were real and remarkable. The Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and their Greek allies held a narrow mountain pass against a massive Persian invasion force, is one of the most famous last stands in all of human history, for very good reason. The discipline and raw courage of Spartan soldiers was genuine, and it earned them a fearsome reputation that lasted for centuries. But impressive does not mean good. Impressive does not mean livable. Impressive does not mean something you should want for yourself. A Category 5 hurricane is impressive. A volcanic eruption is impressive. You would not want to live inside either of those things. Sparta was the same way. It was awe-inspiring and terrifying from a distance, but up close it was a grinding machine that chewed up human beings and spit out soldiers and called the destruction of virtue. So the next time you see someone online saying they were born in the wrong era, Or they wish they could have been a Spartan warrior, or they think modern men are too soft compared to the ancients, just go ahead and send them this. Show them what Sparta actually was beneath all the mythology and the movie magic and the internet bravado. Show them the starving children and the dead babies on the mountainside and the enslaved. Helots being hunted in the dark, and the soldiers who were not allowed to live with their own families, and the society that eventually collapsed in on itself because it was too stubborn and too rigid to ever change. And then ask them if they still want to go back. Because the answer should be no. The answer should always be no. You would not survive in ancient Sparta. Nobody watching this would. And honestly, that is perfectly okay. We were not meant to. We were meant for something better than that. We were meant for a world where you can sit comfortably and safely and learn about history without having to live through the worst parts of it. And that right there is something the Spartans themselves never had. The simple freedom to just exist in peace. So yeah, that is why you would not survive in ancient Sparta. If this made you appreciate your current life, even just a tiny bit, then it did its job. Drop a like if you made it this far, because that means you stuck with this for a very long time, and I genuinely appreciate that. Subscribe if you have not already, because we have a lot more coming. Let us see if we can beat the record. I will see you in the next one.